This program is made possible by this station and other public television stations.
When I was 4 years old, my father built a roadside attraction on US 1 near Cape Canaveral, Florida. Dad worked at the Cape as a rocket engineer, while I helped Mom run the Spacearium. It attracted about 10 tourists a day. The place featured exhibits of rocket stuff that had been sold for scrap out at the Cape. I used to guide the tourists around our satellite models, burned-out rocket engines, and the missile parts that laid sizzling hot out on the sand and back. My favorite exhibit was a cement hemisphere that marked out the flight paths of the early ballistic missiles. The tracking stations from Florida to the Bahamas to Ascension Island were good for hopscotch, and I remember insisting that our visitors spend some time walking on the world as I did. There were a lot of stories about the early days at the Cape. It was chosen to be the Atlantic Missile Range because it was on the ocean, near a string of islands for tracking, and so far from anywhere else that a wild rocket probably wouldn't hit anybody or anything important. To start the testing, they bulldozed a road through the palmettos, and the Air Force trucked in a German V-2 that had been captured in World War II. To extend its range, they bolted a small Army rocket on top for a second stage and called the assembly Bumper. The Cape was such a wilderness, and the mosquitoes were so fierce that the men who were stationed there got hardship pay. The engineers used an old tar paper shack for launch control and had to jump behind sandbags when Bumper's engines were fired. Dad explained that rockets only had two problems, thrust and guidance, and that both had to be worked out before we would be able to defend ourselves. On launch day, only a handful of reporters showed up to see Bumper lift from its pad and head for its target 200 miles downrange. Mom said Bumper surprised a lot of people, especially the residents of nearby towns who didn't know what was going on in the first place.
Into the space age, and this month, the Eastern Space and Missile Center celebrates the event, the 30th anniversary of the launch of Bumper 8, the first major rocket to be launched from Cape Canaveral.
It was a strange thing indeed in this community, because suddenly we heard about the Navy base being reactivated and that it was going to be a missile base. Well, nobody even knew what a missile was. We didn't even know how to spell it.
Well, of course, at that point in time, we were developing weapon systems, you know, and it was a big frantic to get an intermediate-range ballistic missile. The Thor was our first initial operation capable, the IOC, and I'll never forget. The range safety officer was a fellow named Moody, Cotton Moody, and the first good, successful Thor, we were struggling so hard to get one off, and there was a mix-up in signals, and Cotton Moody blew it up. And it was a beautiful missile, made a beautiful, spectacular display.
Daniel.
Yes, sir.
And so it was beginning to stir along to be a very exciting time. And as I mentioned before, there's no way that the wives and the families of all these missile people could have any idea of what was going on up there. Their husbands' lips are completely sealed with security. It was also hush-hush. So I was the only person who could tell them what it was like. And of course, you may be sure the security people briefed me so that I wouldn't give out any secrets.
And I remember we built up from a very low launch rate to a maximum of 287 missiles in a year. We launched 5 major missiles in one day when I was director of range operations. And that was our highlight. And the people just loved it. The workers loved it, the community loved it, and everybody was up on the crest.
By 1955, most of the missile men were confident that rockets would really work. There were rumors that the Russian missile program was nearly operational, and the Defense Department put out contracts for the building and testing of intermediate and intercontinental range missiles, which had impressive names like Thor, Jupiter, Atlas, and Polaris. Word got out fast that the rocket rush was on, and thousands of engineers and technicians packed up their families and moved to the Cape. Mom hoped Cocoa Beach would become a real city, just like Dayton, Ohio, where we lived before. Cement block houses, exactly like ours, were built on all the lots in our neighborhood, and a strip of motels with swimming pools, bars, and live entertainment sprang up along the highway. All the kids took swimming lessons, and our mothers would sit by the pool, trading recipes for getting rid of bugs and mildew. Rockets were going off all the time, but the launch activities were top secret. We had ways of figuring it out. If a bunch of the fathers didn't come home at 5, we knew something was counting down. Dad once fixed the TV so Mom and I could hear a countdown at the Cape. He said not to tell anyone about it. I knew what he meant. When a rocket went off, everyone would run outside, day or night, dressed or not, and yell, "Missile, missile!" The men who were home would gather and talk about gyros and boosters, and those that had been on the countdown, sometimes for days, would hit the strip to celebrate. We went to Mass in the bowling alley, and Father Spellman, who dressed like a missionary, gave communion at the foul line, under a sign which said, "Bowl away your cares and troubles." On Sunday afternoons, we went to the beach and took long, hot drives through the Florida scrub.
Where do you push the button on this?
Right now, you're fired!
My parents were transferred here. They worked up in Seattle and they were transferred from Boeing. We had intentionally had 6 months to live here, and it turned into about 20 years. I have my whole family still here. It's turned into a whole world view for all of us.
When we first moved here in 1959, my dad was one of the first people to come down from the Minuteman project. He used to work on designing aircraft in Seattle, Washington for Boeing, and he first came down here in '59 to, I guess, design a couple missiles.
I think the earliest I remember, I don't have names or anything. I was still too young, but I was pretty impressed by that big ball of fire, moving through the sky. And having my father associated with the space program, too, it gave you a feeling of attachment to everything that was going on at the Cape.
And particularly what I remember most about the space program were the initial boo-boos, the flops, because they would shoot them at night. And they made such a glare and bright colors. We would all stand in the backyard watching the shot. And if they ever hit the button and blew it up, the whole sky would light up. And they did that a lot in those days. I remember missiles landing in the Banana River, and a little too close.
For something over 24 hours now, a new factor of enormous significance has attended the increasingly complicated world in which we live.
Russian scientists toasted each other in vodka tonight over their country's announced launching of a space satellite.
You are hearing the actual signals transmitted by the Earth-circling satellite, one of the great scientific feats of the age.
Now, just what information is being transmitted to Soviet Russia by means of this signal is largely a mystery. As earthbound man reaches upward, groping toward the stars, Russia's achievement has historic importance in many fields: scientific, military, psychological. How great the importance, only time will tell.
When Dad heard the Russians had beaten us into space, he threw up his hands and said, "They've got Sputnik and we've got Kaputnik." Mom and I could tell he wasn't really joking, so we both kept quiet. Dad blamed Washington for allowing the Navy to fool around with Vanguard, when the Army already had plenty of rockets, which could have launched our satellite months before. He said it was high time our dim-witted politicians figured out what they wanted to do, and how they wanted to get the job done. Furthermore, the rumor that the Russians were now capable of waging war from outer space was hogwash. Mom tried to be nice and said something about the tortoise and the hare. Dad said that was hogwash too, and went outside to tune up his car. About 4 months later, everyone was saying that Sputnik was the best thing that ever happened to us. The Army successfully launched a 30-pound satellite, and NASA was formed to run our non-military space program. 7 test pilots were chosen to ride our new Mercury capsules into space. And during 1960, we kept our eyes peeled, looking for astronauts. They came to Cocoa Beach when they were training at the Cape. Once I thought I saw John Glenn running down the beach, but Mom said it was probably just another crazy tourist or a reporter. I knew that only an astronaut would be running up by the dunes, where the sand was soft and deep.
From an undisclosed launching site in the Soviet Union, a multi-stage rocket takes off, successfully launching a man into space. An historic achievement and a victory for the Soviet in the race to achieve the first manned space flight. These sequences graphically show the path of the Russian cosmonaut, Major Yuri Gagarin, on his single spin around the Earth. A 108-minute flight at more than 17,000 miles an hour. As the story was flashed around the world, congratulations poured in for the Soviet scientists and for Major Gagarin, whose name becomes immortal with this feat. In Washington, President Kennedy, who had earlier sent praise for the Soviets' outstanding technical achievement, told Americans that the United States would not match Soviet capabilities in space for some time. He went on to place the historic event in clear perspective.
I do not regard the first man in space as a sign of the weakening of the free world. But I do regard the total mobilization of men and things for the service of the communist bloc over the last years as a source of great danger to us. And I would say we're going to have to live with that danger and hazard through much of the rest of this century.
I asked the other fathers on my street why the Russians had been first again, but they were all too busy to talk to me. When Dad came home, he said because everyone was working overtime at the Cape, and we'd have a man in space very soon. A couple of weeks later, Cocoa Beach was flooded with tourists and reporters. The motels were all full, and a lot of people had to camp out on the beach or sleep in their cars. We drove around to see what they were doing, but mostly they just looked hot and tired. A man in a white convertible flagged us at an intersection and asked for directions to the Cape. When he drove off, Mom laughed and said, "Oh my goodness, that was Walter Cronkite." I told my friends he looked exactly like he did on TV, but Mom said he was much more handsome in person. On launch day, we got up when it was still dark to watch the news. Alan Shepard's flight had been scrubbed 3 days earlier because of bad weather, and Walter Cronkite said clouds in the Cape area might mean yet another delay for America's first manned spaceflight. When Shepard arrived at Pad 5, he didn't look very confident to me, so as we left for the beach, I wondered if this time he was really going to go. We took our car so we could tune the radio to Shorty Powers, who was giving the countdown. All the other cars on the beach were tuned to the same station, and Dad pointed out the rocket in the distance. I pointed out the lighthouse to several people and told them that was the rocket. Mom said not to wander too far, or I might miss the last part of the countdown. Of course, she didn't know exactly when that would happen, so I stayed pretty close to the car and listened intently as Shorty Powers said the magic words.
9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Liftoff.
Liftoff. All right, liftoff, and the clock has started. Yes, sir. Reading you loud and clear.
Trajectory appears okay. Propulsion appears okay.
Now it is time to take longer strides. Time for a great new American enterprise. Time for this nation to take a clearly leading role in space achievement, which in many ways may hold the key to our future on Earth. Recognizing the head start obtained by the Soviets with their large rocket engines, which gives them many months of lead time, and recognizing the likelihood that they will exploit this lead for some time to come in still more impressive successes, we nevertheless are required to make new efforts on our own. I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
5 cabin, oxygen go, all systems are go.
When Shepard came back to Earth, NASA gave our new school an American flag that had been tucked into his capsule. Our principal, Mr. Fritz, organized a ceremony to dedicate the flag and read us a letter from the director of Project Mercury. The letter said, "It is the youth of America who ultimately decide our destiny in space. You and students like you throughout the country will provide the scientific and engineering talent which will lead our nation to great conquests of space in the years to come." After that, we got to go outside whenever a rocket went off. We put on a play called Roundup on the Moon, and my girlfriends practiced baton twirling, trying to make the missile twisters, who performed at important community events. In science class, we watched NASA films that showed all the latest developments in space. Gus Grissom was our next man in space, but his flight was only suborbital like Alan Shepard's. The Soviets had already orbited 2 cosmonauts, so there was a lot of talk about the space gap. Dad said this was mostly exaggerated. He told me that NASA was planning to launch a man into Earth orbit using a huge new booster called Atlas that towered over the Redstone rockets we used before. Dad had been working on the Atlas program since its beginning, and even though he assured me that his rocket was ready to go, I'd seen a lot of the test rockets blow up. So when NASA announced that John Glenn had been selected to pioneer our first Earth orbit, I asked Dad again if everything would be okay. He told me there was nothing to worry about. Both Atlas and Glenn would be fine. By the time launch day arrived, my fears were distracted by a house full of relatives. Mom cooked a turkey for our neighborhood launch party, and Dad had been drawing diagrams and lecturing about rocket engines for days. My cousins and I waited for the final countdown, playing in the sand and mimicking the garbled sounds we heard over the radio.
Throughout childhood, running outside, missile, you know, and I guess the ones in particular, I remember the ones where they'd have parades afterwards, and everybody lined up all along the sides of the streets, and they were really impromptu, you know, you just heard probably either through neighbors or maybe on the radio, there's going to be a parade today or tomorrow, and it looks like the vice president's going to be here, and, boy, it was a big deal. One time, Lyndon Johnson came here, and there was a big parade with him in it, and he came down the road with the astronauts, and they're all sitting in big convertibles waving. It was great.
Roger, the backup clock has started.
We followed the progress of the last 3 Mercury astronauts and gave parades for all of them. But Dad and his friends talked more about defense than they did about our manned space program. An Air Force officer who worked out at Patrick was angry because our government had passed a resolution at the United Nations that said that the arms race shouldn't be extended into outer space. He said it was obvious to everybody that the Soviets were using space for covert military purposes, and that the U.S. space program was creating a missile gap by neglecting its vital defense responsibilities. My father argued that we already had hundreds of ICBMs out west, and squadrons of medium-range missiles in Western Europe and Turkey. The colonel asked my father if he had any idea how many missiles the Soviets had along their borders and throughout the communist bloc. Dad didn't answer, and the colonel said, "Well then, there you have it."
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
We were vulnerable to Soviet missiles for the first time, and the danger of nuclear war was very clear, even to us third graders. We practiced civil defense drills every day at school. When the alarm went off, we turned our desks over, pointed the tops toward the Cape, and ducked behind them. I asked Mom if we would really be safe, and she said, "Don't worry." But things seemed to get worse. U.S. fighter planes soared over our town all day and all night long. They landed at Patrick Air Force Base, which was close by, and lined up by the hundreds, ready to attack. Finally, Khrushchev and Kennedy reached an agreement which ended the conflict. But we were changed. Missiles meant something different. Just a year after the Cuban crisis, we were shocked with the news of President Kennedy's assassination. Cape workers worried that the dream of landing men on the moon would be forgotten, and for a while their well-laid plans seemed confused and meaningless. A few days later, Cape Canaveral was renamed, with the hope that Kennedy's vision would be fulfilled. In December 1963, the Cape was opened to the public for the first time. We were anxious to see the place where our parents worked, so we all piled in cars and headed for the Cape. But we weren't allowed to stop or wander from the official tour route, and we really didn't see much besides miles of sea oats, palmettos, and bay cedars. We read about our parents in a Lou Harris survey published in the local newspaper. The survey said that most of the adults were married and had 2 high-powered luxury cars and 3 kids. Most were registered Democrats who voted for Goldwater in 1964. They like to spend their spare time watching TV, mowing the lawn, or fixing something up around the house. And they like to complain about congested roads, crowded schools, mosquitoes, and taxes. But only a few of them joined civic clubs or attended PTA meetings. Dad said Harris got the figures about right and went back to work on his lunar projections.
Aeronautics and Space Report.
This liftoff marked the beginning of Gordon Cooper's 22-orbit flight. It also brought to a close the Mercury program, proving that man can exist safely in space and do useful work while there. Project Gemini is the next series of manned steps into space. Gemini, designating the spacecraft in which pairs of astronauts will be hurled into orbit by Titan II rockets. The Gemini spacecraft, although similar in shape to the Mercury capsule, is double its size. Project Gemini's main objectives are to conduct scientific experiments, study the effects of long-duration weightlessness, perfect the meeting and joining techniques of two spacecraft, and determine the astronaut's ability to work outside his craft while in space. In this step-by-step fashion, astronauts will be refining rather than developing their skills at space piloting before they move up to the Apollo moon program.
After a while, rocket launches became fairly routine. NASA was sending up satellites every week, and Gemini launches were scheduled every 2 months. By the summer of '64, we were all tired of hearing our fathers lecture to us about the complexities of aeronautics and astrophysics and the importance of becoming scientists or engineers. But we got back in the groove when Ed White stepped out of his capsule and took our first walk in space.
Ready?
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, I'm separating from the spacecraft.
Okay, you're separating from the spacecraft at this time, all right.
Okay, my feet are out.
Okay, your feet are out.
I think I'm dragging a little bit, so I don't want to fire the gun yet.
Yeah, don't kill her.
Okay, I'm out.
Okay, he's out. He's floating free.
Boy, oh boy, oh boy. Yeah, it's something.
It was in pieces when he knocked out. Here, I got one of your gloves. Remember, I got both of your gloves.
Where are we over now, Jim?
I don't know. We're coming over to the west there, and they want you to come back in now.
Back in?
Back in.
Okay, let me just fire a few pictures.
No, back in.
Coming in. Listen, you could almost not drag me in, but I'm coming.
We still got 3.5 more days to go, buddy.
I know it.
Project Gemini was a success, and 7,000 more missile men and their families moved to our county to work on the Apollo moon program. Our ICBMs outnumbered the Soviets 3-1, but we were still trailing their lead in space exploration. The Soviets had been first to send a satellite around the sun, impact the moon, and fly by Venus and Mars. By 1965, we had matched their achievements and launched SYNCOM-3, the first stationary communication satellite. But they beat us again with the first lunar satellite, and they were the first to transmit pictures from the surface of the moon. We accomplished the same feats about 5 months later. But everybody knew that the race to land men on the moon was coming down to the wire.
With this vehicle, the flight to the moon will be accomplished. The Saturn V is taller than the Statue of Liberty. It can carry a payload of 280,000 pounds into a low Earth orbit, which is the equivalent of about 35 Gemini spacecraft.
The spaceport for Apollo moon missions will be Merritt Island, just north of Cape Kennedy. It is here in the Vehicle Assembly Building where the 3 Saturn rocket stages and Apollo spacecraft will be joined for the trip to the moon. Following assembly, Saturn Apollo will travel to the launch pad 3 miles away. This huge vehicle, called the Crawler Transporter, will carry the giant rocket and craft to Pad 39. It is half the size of a football field and creeps along at 1 mile an hour. After all preparations are completed, the Saturn V launch vehicle will start the 3 astronauts on their voyage to the moon. They will travel a flight path similar to this, with the journey taking about 2.5 days. While in orbit around the moon, 2 of the men will crawl into the Lunar Excursion Module. The LEM will be detached from the Command and Service Module. And if all looks well, the astronauts will start their actual landing approach on the lunar surface. The beginning of exploration of the moon will be the culmination of a decade of exhaustive research, development, manufacturing, and testing. But it is only the beginning. Project Apollo, gateway to the planets.
We heard lots of stories about close calls at the Cape, and we worried that one day something would really go wrong. When Apollo 1 was tested under simulated flight conditions, our nightmares became real. Astronauts White, Chafee, and Grissom were killed when a spark from an electrical system caused their capsule to burst into flame.
The worst night that I ever remember was the night they had the fire, and everybody came in and they were talking about it, and people were crying, and it was just like you lost part of your family. Everybody was just so upset. It was just a terrible, eerie night. And just a few weeks before that, I had met Chafee and White. You know, they had been in here with Grissom, and so I knew them, but not like I knew Gus. You know, oh, he was great. You would never know he was really an astronaut because he was just like your friend. And everybody felt so close to, particularly Gus, you know, that they were just really torn up.
After the fire, the Apollo program ground to a halt, and the news was full of reports about all the investigations that were going on out at the Cape. Problems were found in the spacecraft's design and construction, and even though we heard that NASA was having the capsule rebuilt and retested, our doubts about the Apollo program lingered for nearly 2 years. In high school, we had advanced math and science courses and team systems for improving our education, but we weren't too interested in institutional plans. The war in Vietnam was getting worse, and while we didn't exactly live on a military base, it was close. My boyfriend's father worked on the Polaris, and he went off each evening saying, "I'm going to work to defend our country." Long hair and peace signs would send adults through the roof and escalate the arguments about the harmful effects of drugs and loud music, and the dangers of wearing short skirts and tight jeans. School was a little less hassle. It got so they let us skip the pep rallies and hang out in the cafeteria instead.
We're here for a class reunion, 10 years, long time.
What was going on in the high schools? A lot of playing. There's a really relaxed atmosphere here. In those days, even now, you sense it. And I think the pressure wasn't a pressure to really achieve a great deal. You know, or if you did, it came from within. It wasn't from external things. Surfing was a pastime, and sports, of course, were a big thing. And there was quite a bit of drugs.
Well, there was ROTC, that was memorable. Then there was the,
It was almost uncool to be ambitious. You weren't allowed to be ambitious. As a matter of fact, I was involved in gymnastics, and the only reason I was allowed to be by my peers was it was in another town. So it was like I was a closet gymnast, and I was, you know, I just sit and groove every other time. And so it was a different atmosphere. Cheerleaders were not, it was just very different. And I had no idea. I thought that was normal until I moved away.
During that time, I was a bellboy at one of the motels locally. And I'd met a lot of people, you know, coming in from national news. It was pretty exciting at the time. A lot of foreign journalists.
Well, I think in some ways we were worldly without traveling because it was a transient town, and we were reading books by Alan Watt and, you know, Timothy Leary. If you could consider him worldly, I don't know, but in a way we were sophisticated. In a way we were very naive because we lived in an atmosphere that wasn't normative. We had no black people, no rich people, no poor people. We had middle-class Watts, and we thought that was. We had no idea, really.
Apollo 7 through 10 were successful manned missions that rehearsed the lunar landing, and we pulled ahead of the Soviets for the first time. When Apollo 10 came back, Cocoa Beach had its first astronaut parade since the early days. They rounded up the high school band, and Cape workers bragged again that they had rocket fuel in their veins. No one knew for sure what the Soviets were up to. But when NASA announced that Apollo 11 was go, our parents were feeling pretty confident about winning the race to the moon. When I asked just what was the point of the race, it was the colonel that said, "Those moon rocks will earn the U.S. some respect." My friends and I spent the hours before liftoff down at the beach, surfing and listening to Jimi Hendrix. And we cruised up and down, checking out the tourists. We knew from experience that just before the launch, every car would pull off the highway. So one of my friends calculated that if we waited until about T-minus 10 minutes, we could beat all the traffic and still make it over to the Banana River Bridge in time to see the liftoff. It sounded like a pretty good plan, so we hung out until we didn't see any more cars moving down the highway, and then drove our old Falcon as fast as it would go, over the deserted roads and out toward the Cape. We reached the top of the bridge just in time to see the ignition of the massive Saturn V.
At 2:20 a.m. Monday, July 21st, a date which will live in history as long as man is on this planet and on the other planets. 38-year-old civilian Neil Alden Armstrong is to become the first human being to touch the moon.
S2, pre-press complete flight. CDR and LMP, panel 6 and 9, pat mount off.
Roger, understand. Go for landing, 3,000 feet. 75 feet. Car's looking good, down a half. Lights on. 40 feet down, 2.5. Picking up some dust. 30 feet, 2.5 down. Straight shadow. Contact light. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
And we're getting a picture on the TV.
You got a good picture, huh?
There's a great deal of contrast in it, and currently it's upside down on our monitor, but we can make out a fair amount of detail.
I'm at the foot of the ladder. The limb footbeds are only depressed in the surface about 1 or 2 inches, although the surface appears to be very, very fine-grained as you get close to it. It's almost like a powder. Ground mass is very fine. I'm going to step off the limb now. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Dear men from the planet Earth, first set foot upon the moon, July 1969 AD. It came in peace for all mankind. The crew members' signatures and the signature of the President of the United States.
10, 9, ignition sequence start. 5, 4, we have ignition.
My first real job as an engineering intern for Apollo 17, our last moon launch. I promised that I wouldn't divulge any space secrets or ever become a member of the Communist Party, and a personnel director gave me a badge, a schedule, and a hearty slap on the back. Being part of the NASA team meant playing it very cool, so I put a plastic pencil caddy in my pocket and tried to act casual as I went to my first assignment. Part of my job was to help double-check the hydraulic components for the flight control systems. My supervisor had handed me a 10-pound procedure manual and said, "Don't worry, even a monkey could follow it." But for every component, there were hundreds of parts, and for every system, there were at least 2 backups. So even a small job became a task of exponential proportions. Testing and retesting wore on for months as the rocket was assembled and moved to its pad. Then things started to get interesting. Countdown began at T-minus 6 days, 55 minutes, and counting. I was assigned to work in launch control, which was the nerve center of the entire launch operation. I sat in a small office next to the firing room and listened through headphones to the engineers checking computer data. When a problem showed up, I circulated memos to the department heads and to the chief engineers, who sat in long tiered rows according to their status. The launch directors would talk with their subordinates and decide whether to put a hold on countdown, run more computer checks, or just go ahead with the backup. If the problem didn't show up again, the engineers would shrug and say, "Just a phantom." By T-minus 1 hour, we had accumulated 2 hours of unexpected hold, and palms began to sweat. I drank my first cup of coffee and flashed through the endless months of pre-launch testing. My supervisor tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Remember, honey, if anything can go wrong, it will go wrong, especially if it's hooked up to a computer." I forced a smile, and he said, "Hey, lighten up. This baby's gonna go." By midnight, thousands of handmade parts were working smoothly through hundreds of computers operated by dozens of engineers. The system was fragile, but there were backups. It was our last moonshot. We'd do it right. We'd done it right before. At T-minus 30 seconds, the automatic sequencer shut down. Countdown ground to a halt. A decision had been made to extend the pressure tolerance on one of the fuel tanks, and someone forgot to override the computer. Nothing was wrong after all. Apollo 17 was go. the rocket cleared the tower, the mission was under Houston's control. So we wandered around for a while, patting each other on the back and shaking hands. There was some talk about going out to celebrate, but I was exhausted. It was our last moonshot, and we did it right. After Apollo 17, Cape activity slowed down almost as fast as it had boomed. The war in Vietnam continued to drain the economy, and funding for the space program was drastically reduced. Our first joint venture with the Soviets was in the works, but it had more to do with the politics of détente than it did with space exploration. There was some talk about developing a reusable space shuttle, and Skylab was under construction, but only a few other projects were planned, and Cape workers were notified that they might be laid off at any time. Engineers with 15 or 20 years tenure found themselves jobless, with no retirement benefits. And the science field was so flooded that employment agencies wouldn't even make appointments with most of them. A lot of people hung around town hoping to be hired by another contractor for a few more years. They delivered phone books and took other part-time jobs to ease the tension of waiting. Marriages fell apart, people moved away at about the same rate they had moved in, and houses that couldn't be sold were abandoned. I left the engineering track and signed up to study art. It seemed like a more practical field at the time. I moved away, but some of my friends stayed on, and eventually got jobs at the Cape.
I'm somewhat secure, I guess. I've just seen this place come and go too many times. Now I have some friends that came from Alabama, California, all sorts of places to work on this program, and they never saw what happened here. I always wondered. My father, of course, worked in more or less, hard to say, professional skill, but some of my friends' fathers worked as technicians like myself, and we always wondered what they did, and now I know exactly what they did. I've worked wings and mid-body and modifications, and I worked on the engine crew. I've worked the whole thing except the forward. And it's a good feeling. The day I showed up at work, I had my tools with me in the back of my car, and it was heck, a week before I even pulled them out. There's been times, don't get me wrong, I've worked 13, 14 hours without lunch. You know what I'm saying? But anything that big's got to be the way it is. It's the easiest, most effective way to do something.
I guess I kind of followed the tradition because I'm working for the space program too. So I'm in quality control and I'm working on the shuttle program. When my dad first came here, he was working on the Snark, and that rocket was like a bird. I mean, it was like I refer to birds like airplanes because working on the shuttle, we call it the bird. It was really pioneering. It was right after Werner von Braun, and, you know, it was really the very early days, and they were really researching it and finding things out, and I think they still are. I think it's still in its very early stages. I think it's important.
Think you might buy any of those?
Yeah, I'm going to buy these. I work on the launch team, and I'm going to just put these on my jacket. I work for NASA, and we all have launch team jackets. All the contractors have jackets. NASA has jackets. So it gets to be sort of a personal thing. Each person customizes his own jacket with patches that are favorite to him. I'm going to put an American flag on mine, and I'm going to put this one, which is the first launch, on the left breast. And since I was also in on Apollo 11, which was to us probably the most important one, first lunar landing, we're going to put that on too. It's been a long time between launches. You know, it's been nearly, when was our last launch? 75s? The Apollo Soyuz. It's been a long time since we put anything up with a man in it. So we'll be ready. We're ready. We're doing what we do best right now, and that's counting down.
Mom kept in touch about the space shuttle's progress by sending me bundles of articles clipped from the local newspaper. Some of the headlines boasted the beginning of routine access to space. Others lamented the endless technical problems that had cost millions of dollars and caused months of delay. There were frequent letters to the editor about our new space policy, which would allocate 80% of the budget to defense-related missions, the remaining 20% to scientific exploration. Mom said there was some concern around town that if the first test flights were unsuccessful, the negative publicity alone would be enough to set the program back for a number of years. Dad and some of his friends were skeptical about the complicated design that was required to launch the shuttle like a rocket and return it like an airplane. Mom was amused that the same bunch of mavericks that had put wings on the old Snark and Matador had gotten so conservative in their old age. I remembered those early military launches and how we all grew up with rockets going off almost every day and the special feeling of a manned launch. After that, I had to see this one and get that old countdown and liftoff rush. A couple of weeks before launch, I got a postcard from Dad. It said, at 8 seconds mission elapsed time, 400 feet altitude, STS-1 will roll 120 degrees. NASA will have to hold for perfectly clear weather. Should make a pretty picture.
Is satisfactory. So we'll be back with more after this.
Process for special mission on the shuttle inside.
That's 40 seconds and counting. At the present time, everything going very smoothly. The weather aircraft should be taking off shortly. The landing and recovery director has also given a verbal for takeoff of the weather aircraft.
T-minus 5 minutes, 30 seconds, mark, and counting.
Wow, I think it's going to come.
Coming up on T-minus 3 minutes, T-minus 3 minutes, and counting. The engine gimbal, our movement check is underway to ensure they're ready for flight control. T-minus 2 minutes, 52 seconds, the alarm will open the external tank.
En su cuenta, hasta el minuto.
Limited to 3 minutes, 36 seconds. T-minus 2 minutes, 40 seconds, and counting. The fuel cell ground supply of oxygen and hydrogen has been terminated, and the vehicle is using its onboard supply. T-minus 2 minutes, 15 seconds. The pressure in the box tank is at flight pressure. Liquid hydrogen tank is at flight pressure. T-minus 1 minute, mark, and counting. Water will be armed just a couple seconds from now. It has been armed. T-minus 45 seconds and counting. T-minus 40 seconds and counting. The development flight instrumentation recorders are on. T-minus 35 seconds. We're just a few seconds away from switching to the redundant send sequencer. T-minus 27 seconds. We have gone for redundant set sequencer start. T-minus 20 seconds and counting.
Do it.
T-minus 15, 14,
God,
13,
mine's already jumping.
T-minus
10,
9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4.
There it goes. They lit up the wings already. Do it! Yeah! 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 Damn! Holy Lord. Do it! Now it's going to roll. Now you hear the roar. Now it's coming. God, you can feel it. Feel it right in the bottom of your feet. Oh, it's just so bloody beautiful. They're just so proud. Oh,
Are they gonna blow up?
they are. excited. Finally, we got the son of a bitch out of here.
Roger on the tip, Columbia. Mark, 2 minutes 20 seconds. Confirm solid rocket booster step.
C'est sensationnel. Pour l'instant, ça dépasse le jugement.
Anyway, Columbia is in orbit. The launch was absolutely beautiful. Flawless launch. Today, a flawless countdown. There was not 1 minute of excitement.
It weighed 4,5 million pounds.
Gespielt hat. In den Augenblicken, das heißt in den Minuten vor dem Start, dass immer klarer wurde.
Since 1950, when that first German V-2 rocket was fired, that and this, and these few intervening years, again, it shows literally what man's dream can accomplish and how
the U.S. manned space effort is back on track. From the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, this is Max Gomez, Channel 5 News.
After the liftoff, we talked about the old days of the Cape and the rocket launches that measured our growth. We told stories about the early missile flops, and my nephew thought we were just making them up. I asked Dad how long it would be before a space station would be operational. He scratched some figures on a paper napkin and said, 10 years and 20 minutes. I asked about the 20 minutes, and Dad smiled and said, that's how long it'll take to make the commute from Cocoa Beach, Florida.
This program was made possible by this station and other public television stations.